The young girl was left hungry and alone, a forgotten shadow in a world that had turned its back. The mountain man, weathered by solitude and haunted by his own past, discovered her shivering in the wilderness that fateful winter morning. Hope bloomed in the most unexpected place when he offered not just shelter, but a home where her heart could finally heal. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The icy winds of Hollow Creek tore through the narrow alleys, carrying whispers and judgment with each bitter gust. Winter had settled early this year, transforming the village into a maze of shadows and suspicion. Mary Smith huddled in the darkest corner of what had once been her family home, now just an abandoned shell with gaps in the walls where warmth escaped. The 14-year-old pressed her thin frame against the splintered wood, as if the decaying structure might somehow shield her from both the cold and the village's stares. Her stomach twisted with a familiar pain, 3 days now since her last proper meal. The gnawing emptiness had become a constant companion, more reliable than any friend in Hollow Creek. Mary pulled her threadbare jacket tighter, the fabric worn so thin it barely deserved the name. Her haunted eyes, too large for her gaunt face, scanned the street through a crack in the boarded window. Outside, Mrs. Peterson hurried past with her market basket, deliberately averting her gaze from the Smith house. Just months ago, the same woman had brought fresh bread and kind words. Now she crossed to the opposite side of the lane, muttering about bad fortune and that poor cursed child. 2 village boys followed, pointing and whispering before their mother shooed them away with frightened glances over her shoulder. The Smith girl brings nothing but trouble, a man's voice carried on the wind. Best to leave her be before her misfortune spreads. Mary slid down the wall until she sat on the dirt floor, drawing her knees to her chest. The cold seeped through her worn shoes, numbing her toes. She had become a ghost in her own village, visible enough to fear but not human enough to help. The irony wasn't lost on her. They feared catching her misfortune while their abandonment was the cruelest misfortune of all. Night approached, bringing deeper cold and heavier silence. The familiar sounds of village life, laughter, conversation, the clatter of cooking reached her from distant homes where families gathered. Each muffled sound was a reminder of what she'd lost. Mary traced patterns in the dust, remembering when this room had held her mother's rocking chair and her father's books. As darkness fell completely, she curled into herself beneath a pile of old sacking, her bed now. The silence of the abandoned house pressed down, growing heavier with each passing hour, until it felt like another presence entirely, threatening to suffocate her with its weight. Tomorrow would bring more hunger, more averted eyes, more whispers. But tonight, as on every night since being left alone, Mary closed her eyes and pretended the footsteps she heard might be someone coming back for her. One evening, as dusk painted the jagged peaks in purple and gold, Mary Smith wrapped herself in a threadbare shawl and slipped into the forest. The village of Hollow Creek had fallen silent behind her, its windows glowing with warmth she was no longer welcome to share. Her stomach cramped painfully, a constant reminder of days without proper nourishment. The crunch of leaves beneath her thin shoes was the only sound accompanying her desperate search for food. The forest floor offered little, a handful of withered berries here, a few nuts there, barely enough to quiet the gnawing emptiness inside her. She moved deeper into the woods, her fingers numb with cold as they brushed against rough tree bark for support. Just a little further, she whispered to herself, her breath forming small clouds in the chilling air. The 14-year-old had learned which plants might still yield something edible even as autumn tightened its grip on the mountain. Her haunted eyes scanned the undergrowth, hoping for mushrooms or late-season roots. Her legs trembled with each step, muscles weakened by hunger and exhaustion. The shawl, once her mother's, did little to shield her from the biting wind that whispered through the trees. Mary stumbled over an exposed root, catching herself against a pine trunk, her palms scraping against rough bark. Standing upright again required all her remaining strength. Shadows lengthened around her as daylight faded. The forest, once familiar, now seemed to close in with menacing indifference. She pushed onward, driven by the simple primal need to survive another night. Each step became a negotiation with her failing body, a promise that just beyond the next ridge, the next clearing, she might find something to ease her hunger. Just as despair threatened to swallow her whole, the rhythmic thud of hooves cut through the silence. Mary froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound grew louder, more distinct. Someone was approaching along the shadowy trail ahead. Her first instinct was to hide, to shrink back into the darkness. The villagers had made their feelings clear. No one from Hollow Creek would help her. Yet she remained rooted in place, too weak to run, too desperate to hide. The frail girl clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, watching the trail with a mixture of fear and the faintest flicker of hope. Perhaps, she thought, whoever approached might spare something, anything to help her survive another day in this wilderness that had become her reluctant home. Through the dense foliage, a figure materialized like a specter from the mountain mist. John Johnson emerged from the trees, his imposing silhouette cutting against the fading light. The villagers of Hollow Creek had many names for him: the Mountain Man, the Hermit, the Recluse, each whispered with equal parts fear and reverence. His weather-beaten face told stories of harsh winters and solitary survival, while his calloused hands spoke of a life built through sheer determination. Mary froze in place, her thin frame trembling not just from hunger, but from the sudden appearance of this legendary figure. The Mountain Man was something of a myth in Hollow Creek, a cautionary tale mothers told their children to keep them from wandering too far into the wilderness. Some claimed he was a madman who'd fled civilization, others insisted he possessed ancient wisdom that allowed him to commune with the forest itself. All agreed on one thing: John Johnson wanted nothing to do with the world that had rejected him, preferring the honest brutality of nature to the veiled cruelty of people. His horse, a sturdy creature as resilient as its master, snorted softly in the evening air. John's piercing gaze, normally sharp enough to track prey through the densest underbrush, softened visibly when it fell upon Mary. Something in her hunched posture and hollow cheeks stirred memories he'd long buried beneath years of isolation. The Recluse studied the girl for a moment, recognizing in her haunted eyes a reflection of his own past suffering. Without a word, he dismounted from his horse, his movements deliberate yet gentle, as if approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden gesture. The forest around them grew quiet, as if holding its breath. Even the wind seemed to pause its eternal journey through the trees. John took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between them with careful respect for her obvious fear. When he finally stood before her, the Mountain Man did something that would have shocked anyone from Hollow Creek who claimed to know his ways. He extended his hand, a weathered palm offered without demand or expectation, in a gesture of cautious kindness that surprised them both. The simple act hung between them, transforming the chasm of their differences into a bridge. In that moment, something unspoken passed between the 14-year-old outcast and the solitary mountain dweller, a recognition that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources, and that the first step toward healing begins with a hand extended in the wilderness. "Hey there," John Johnson said, his voice low but steady, as he knelt beside her. "You don't have to be out here alone." The offer was simple, yet it cracked open a dam of longing in Mary's heart. The Mountain Man's weather-beaten face showed no trace of the malice she'd grown accustomed to in Hollow Creek. His eyes, though cautious, held something Mary hadn't seen directed at her in months: genuine concern. She studied him warily, her thin frame shivering against the evening chill. "I have food," he added softly, gesturing toward his saddlebag, "and shelter." Though every instinct screamed at her to run, her desperation outweighed her fear. Hollow Creek had taught her harsh lessons about trust, but starvation was a more immediate threat. Her stomach twisted painfully, reminding her how long it had been since her last proper meal. With trembling fingers, she accepted his hand. The warmth of his calloused palm against her ice-cold skin felt almost shocking. John gently lifted her onto his horse, her 14-year-old body weighing almost nothing in his strong arms. "Hold tight," he instructed, wrapping her in a thick woolen blanket that smelled of pine and smoke. The fabric enveloped her completely, its weight both comforting and strange, after so many nights with only threadbare coverings. Mary clutched the animal's mane as John mounted behind her. The Recluse adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, careful not to crowd her. She tensed at his proximity, so unused to human contact that even this simple kindness felt overwhelming. "The cabin's not far," he murmured, as they began moving. "Just up the mountain away." The rhythm of the horse's gait nearly lulled her to sleep, the combination of exhaustion and sudden safety making her eyelids heavy. She fought to stay alert, still uncertain if she'd made the right choice. The forest around them grew denser, shadows lengthening as they climbed higher away from the village that had shunned her. John remained silent behind her, seemingly understanding her need for space even in this shared journey. Mary's mind raced with questions. Why would this solitary man help her? What would he expect in return? The villagers spoke of him with fear and suspicion, yet here he was, offering sanctuary when no one else would. The blanket trapped her body heat, warming her for the first time in days. Despite her weariness, Mary found herself leaning back slightly, drawn to the steady presence of the first person who had seen her, truly seen her, since everything fell apart. The journey up the mountain was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Mary Smith gripped tightly around John Johnson's waist as the horse navigated the treacherous path. Each step the animal took sent vibrations through her exhausted body, but the steady rhythm eventually became soothing. The 14-year-old hadn't felt human warmth in so long that the simple contact with another person made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. "We're almost there," John said over his shoulder, his voice barely audible above the wind rustling through the pines. Mary nodded silently, unable to form words. The forest that had always seemed so threatening now formed a protective canopy above them. Moonlight filtered through branches, casting dappled shadows across the path. She noticed how the mountain man read the terrain instinctively, guiding his mount around hidden obstacles with practiced ease. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and colder. The girl pulled the woolen blanket tight around her shoulders, grateful for its weight and warmth. It smelled of pine needles and wood smoke, unfamiliar but somehow reassuring. The scent reminded her that she was moving away from Hollow Creek, away from the averted gazes and cruel whispers. After what seemed like hours, a small structure emerged from the darkness. John's cabin stood solid against the mountainside, its windows dark but promising shelter. He dismounted first, then carefully helped Mary down. Her legs nearly buckled beneath her, weak from hunger and exhaustion. "Easy now," he murmured, steadying her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. Inside, the recluse moved with practiced efficiency, striking a fire in the stone hearth while Mary stood awkwardly by the door. The cabin was simple but orderly, a single room with a bed against one wall, a rough-hewn table, and shelves lined with jars of preserved foods and medicinal herbs. "Sit," John instructed, gesturing toward a chair by the table. He ladled stew from a pot hanging near the fire and placed the bowl before her with a chunk of dark bread. Mary stared at the food, suddenly overwhelmed. When was the last time someone had prepared a meal for her? The girl's hands trembled as she lifted the spoon to her lips. The mountain man sat across from her, his weather-beaten face illuminated by the dancing firelight. Deep lines of worry etched his forehead as he watched her eat with desperate hunger. Neither spoke as she emptied the bowl, then tentatively reached for the bread. The crackling fire cast long shadows across the cabin walls. In Mary's exhausted face, John saw a reflection of his own past suffering, and in his eyes she glimpsed something she'd almost forgotten existed: compassion without expectation. The mountain air stung Mary Smith's lungs as she followed John Johnson up a narrow trail. 2 weeks had passed since he'd brought her to his cabin, and today marked her first lesson in foraging. The mountain man moved with practiced ease, his weathered hands pointing to clusters of dark berries nestled among thorny bushes. "These blackberries are safe," he explained, his voice low and steady. "But those red ones over there, they'll have you sick for days." Mary nodded, her thin fingers trembling as she reached for the fruit. She fumbled, dropping more than she collected. Frustration burned behind her eyes, but John simply knelt beside her, demonstrating the gentle twist needed to free the berries without crushing them. "Nobody learns this overnight," he assured her. "Took me years. Each day brought new knowledge." John taught her which mushrooms could nourish and which could kill, how to identify healing herbs by their scent and texture. He showed her how to read the clouds. Wispy strands meant fair weather, while dark, bulging formations warned of approaching storms. The 14-year-old absorbed everything, her haunted eyes gradually brightening with each small success. "The mountain speaks," John told her one evening as they sat by the crackling fire. "Most folks just forgot how to listen." Mary's hands grew steadier as the days passed. She learned to weave baskets from supple branches, to start fires with flint and dried moss, to mend tears in clothing with careful stitches. Each task she mastered built something inside her that Hollow Creek had nearly destroyed: confidence. When she successfully brewed her first medicinal tea from pine needles and wild mint, John's weather-beaten face broke into a rare smile. "Your hands remember what your mind is still learning," he said. Sometimes Mary would catch him watching her with an expression that reminded her of the journal hidden beneath the floorboards, a mixture of hope and protective fear. She wondered about the woman in his letters, the one he'd lost, but couldn't find the courage to ask. One morning, as dawn painted the cabin in soft gold, Mary woke to find John had left a small knife beside her bed, its wooden handle polished smooth. The gesture spoke volumes: trust, respect, recognition of her growing capability. That evening she used it to carve notches into a stick, marking each day since her arrival. The simple calendar represented something profound: time measured not in loneliness and hunger, but in learning and healing. "I think I'm getting stronger," she whispered to John as they shared a meal of rabbit stew. He nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. "The mountain gives strength to those who respect it," he replied, "and you're learning faster than most." For the first time since her parents vanished, Mary felt the fragile seedling of belonging taking root in her heart. The mountain had transformed from prison to sanctuary for Mary Smith. Each morning she woke to sunlight filtering through the pines, casting dancing shadows across the sturdy cabin John Johnson had built with his own hands. What once felt like exile now embraced her like a protective cloak. The scent of burning wood from the hearth, the rush of a nearby stream tumbling over smooth stones, and the sweet tart taste of wild berries became integral parts of her healing. "Listen," John would say, his weathered finger pointing to the canopy above. "Nature speaks if you're patient enough to hear it." Mary learned to distinguish between the warning calls of jays and the cheerful chirps of chickadees. She began to recognize which rustling meant deer and which signaled the approach of a fox. The mountain man taught her how to read the sky, predicting storms hours before clouds gathered on the horizon. In the evenings they would sit on the porch, wrapped in woolen blankets against the cooling air. The 14-year-old found comfort in these quiet moments, watching shadows lengthen across the clearing. Sometimes they spoke of practical things, which roots could be harvested or how to preserve meat for winter. Other times they simply existed together in companionable silence. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," Mary confessed one evening, her voice barely audible above the chorus of crickets. John nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The mountain has a way of healing what villages—" She studied his profile, noting how his stern features softened in the fading light. The recluse, who had terrified Hollow Creek's children with his legend, had become her protector, her teacher, her friend. In his presence, Mary felt truly seen for perhaps the first time in her young life. One afternoon, while gathering kindling near the stream, she caught her reflection in a still pool. The haunted look that had once dominated her eyes had receded, replaced by something steadier. Her cheeks, though still thin, no longer appeared hollow. The mountain was rebuilding her, just as surely as it had shaped the man who'd rescued her. That night, as embers glowed in the fireplace, Mary realized what had changed most profoundly. In Hollow Creek, she had been defined by absence of family, of acceptance, of hope. Here, with John, she existed as herself, valued not for what she might provide others, but simply for being. The revelation settled in her chest, like warmth from the fire, a small but unshakable certainty that perhaps she belonged somewhere after all. Rain pattered against the cabin's wooden roof, creating a soothing rhythm that had lulled John Johnson to sleep hours ago. Mary Smith lay awake, listening to his steady breathing from across the room. After nearly a month in the mountain sanctuary, she'd grown comfortable with their simple routine, yet questions about her silent protector lingered in her mind. Lightning illuminated the cabin, casting strange shadows across the floor. In that brief flash, Mary noticed something she hadn't seen before: the corner of a trunk peeking out from beneath John's bed. Curiosity overcame her caution. She slipped from her makeshift bed, careful not to wake the mountain man as she crept across the creaking floorboards. The battered trunk was heavy, its leather straps worn with age. Mary hesitated, her conscience battling her curiosity. This was John's private possession, yet something pulled her toward it with undeniable force. With trembling fingers, she unlatched the clasp. Inside lay bundles of letters, their edges yellowed and fragile. The handwriting was delicate, feminine, so unlike John's rough scrawl she'd seen on hunting maps. The first letter began with "My dearest John," and spoke of spring flowers and hope. Mary's heart raced as she unfolded another, then another. They told a story of love between John and a woman named Elizabeth. Their romance had blossomed despite the disapproval of her family and their village. The later letters grew desperate as Elizabeth described falling ill, begging John not to blame himself. The final letter, its ink blotched with what might have been tears, revealed how the villagers had denied Elizabeth proper care, believing her illness was punishment for loving the wild man of the mountains. "I leave this world loving you still," Elizabeth had written. "Please don't let your heart grow cold." Mary wiped away her own tears, understanding now why John had retreated so completely from the world. His pain mirrored her own. The cruelty of people, the sting of rejection, the hollow ache of abandon. The mountain wasn't just his home, it was his fortress against further heartbreak. She carefully returned the letters to their resting place, closing the trunk with reverence. As she slipped back to her bed, Mary saw John in a new light. The stern, silent man who'd rescued her carried wounds as deep as her own. His kindness wasn't just charity, it was recognition of a shared pain. For the first time since being abandoned, Mary felt truly understood. They were both survivors of the world's harshness, finding in each other what the village had denied them both: compassion without judgment. The cabin had grown familiar to Mary Smith over the weeks, each creaking floorboard and drafty corner becoming part of her new world. One evening, while John Johnson was out checking his traps, she noticed something odd, a plank that shifted slightly when she stepped on it. Curiosity piqued. The 14-year-old knelt down and pried at the loose floorboard with trembling fingers. Hidden beneath was a small leather-bound journal, its edges worn and pages yellowed with age. Mary's heart nearly stopped when she opened it. The handwriting, though shakier than she remembered, was unmistakably her mother's. She clutched the journal to her chest, suddenly afraid of what truths it might contain. Taking a deep breath, she began to read by the flickering light of the cabin's fire. The words flowed across the pages like a confession, her mother's desperate plan to escape Hollow Creek with Mary, to find safety away from those who had turned against them. The journal spoke of illness, of growing suspicion from neighbors, and of a mother's fierce determination to protect her child. "I cannot let them take you," one passage read. "There must be someone with kindness left in this cold world. Never stop searching for those worthy of your trust." Tears streamed down Mary's face, blurring the ink before her. All this time she'd believed herself abandoned, cast aside like something worthless. The truth was far different. Her parents had fought for her until they couldn't fight anymore. The journal revealed how her mother had known John, the reclusive mountain man, by reputation alone, a man who kept to himself but had once helped a lost child find their way home. She had hoped Mary might somehow find her way to him if the worst happened. Was it fate or her plan all along? Mary whispered to the empty cabin, running her fingers over the faded ink. When John returned that evening, he found her sitting quietly by the fire, the journal closed on her lap. The girl looked up at him with eyes that held something new, a fierce determination that replaced the haunted emptiness he'd grown accustomed to seeing. "She knew about you," Mary said simply. "My mother. She hoped I'd find you." The mountain man set down his gear and sat beside her, his weathered face softening in the firelight. He didn't need to ask who she was. "I never met your mother," he admitted, "but I wish I had." That night, a profound connection settled between them, not just the bond of survivor and protector, but something deeper. Mary finally understood that her journey to this cabin hadn't been mere chance. It was the last gift from parents who had loved her enough to plan for her survival, even when they couldn't ensure their own. The final patches of snow melted away, revealing tender shoots of green across the mountainside. Mary Smith had just begun to feel safe when the trouble arrived with the spring thaw. One crisp morning, as she gathered herbs near the stream, the sound of multiple footsteps crunching through the underbrush made her freeze. 5 men from Hollow Creek emerged from the tree line, their faces set with determination. Mary recognized Thomas Fletcher, the village elder, leading the group with his walking stick thumping against the soft earth. The others were familiar too, shopkeepers and farmers, who had once turned their backs when she begged for scraps. "There she is," Thomas called out, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Mary, you need to return with us. Your parents left you something, a small plot of land and some savings. As village elders, we've been entrusted with your inheritance until you come of age." Mary backed away, her basket of herbs clutched tightly against her chest. The men's words sounded reasonable, but their eyes told a different story, one of calculation and opportunity. She had learned to read people during her months of abandonment, and these men weren't here out of concern. "I'm staying here," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady despite her racing heart. John Johnson appeared silently at the edge of the clearing, his imposing figure causing the villagers to shift uncomfortably. The mountain man said nothing at first, simply moving to stand beside Mary. "The girl stays where she chooses," he finally stated, his deep voice leaving no room for argument. "Any inheritance can wait until she's ready." Thomas stepped forward, his friendly facade slipping. "This isn't your decision, Johnson. She belongs in the village, under proper guardianship. There are questions about how you took her." "I didn't take anyone," John interrupted. "I offered shelter when you all turned your backs." Mary noticed John's hand move slightly, signaling her toward a narrow path behind them. She understood immediately. They had practiced this, prepared for this moment when the village might come calling. In one swift motion, John stepped between Mary and the villagers, creating a distraction as she slipped away down the hidden trail. The mountain man followed moments later, expertly covering their tracks as they navigated paths, invisible to untrained eyes. As they moved deeper into the forest, John taught Mary how to walk without breaking branches, how to cross streams to mask their scent, and most importantly, when to hide and when to confront. "Sometimes courage isn't about fighting," he explained as they reached a hidden overlook where they could see the frustrated villagers searching below. "Sometimes it's knowing when to retreat, regroup, and choose your battles wisely." Mary nodded, understanding blooming within her. This wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. For the first time in her life, she wasn't simply running away in fear. She was making a choice. For the first time in her young life, Mary Smith felt the stirring of something unfamiliar power, not the kind that crushes others beneath its weight, but the liberating strength that comes from knowing one's own worth. With John Johnson beside her, she was no longer merely surviving, she was actively shaping her destiny. "You're quick on your feet," John remarked one evening after they'd evaded another group of villagers from Hollow Creek. His weather-beaten face creased with a rare smile. Most folks would have frozen up back there. Mary beamed at the praise, remembering how she'd spotted the telltale signs of intruders and suggested an alternate path home. Each close call with the villagers had taught her something valuable: how to read footprints, how to move silently through underbrush, when to hide and when to run. The mountain that had once seemed so forbidding now revealed itself as a teacher. Every challenge it presented, sudden storms, difficult terrain, scarcity, became an opportunity for growth. The cabin transformed into more than shelter. It became a sanctuary where Mary could explore her emerging talents without judgment. One rain-soaked morning, they discovered a fox collapsed near their doorstep, its russet fur matted with blood from a deep gash along its flank. While John stepped back, Mary knelt beside the trembling creature. "She's terrified," Mary whispered, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Can we help her?" The mountain man nodded, his eyes reflecting something like pride. "I think you already know how." With gentle hands, Mary cleaned the wound using the herbs she'd been gathering, yarrow to stop bleeding, comfrey to speed healing. John guided her through the process, but it was Mary who sensed which plants the animal would tolerate, how much pressure to apply, when to offer water. For 3 days the fox hovered between life and death. Mary slept beside its makeshift bed, waking at the slightest whimper. On the 4th morning, the animal lapped water from her palm, its amber eyes clear and alert. "You've got a healer's touch," John observed quietly. "Some folks spend a lifetime trying to develop what comes natural to you." Mary stroked the fox's head, marveling at how something so wild could trust her so completely. In this creature's recovery, she saw a reflection of her own journey, from wounded and fearful to strong and trusting. "I never thought I could help anything," she admitted. "Back in the village, I was just the girl everyone avoided." John's expression softened. "That's what happens when you let others define you. Up here you're writing your own story." As the fox eventually limped back into the forest, Mary understood that she too had been transformed. She wasn't just John's ward or Hollow Creek's outcast. She was becoming someone with gifts to offer the world. The wounded fox became Mary's first true patient. Each morning she would carefully clean its injuries, applying the poultices John Johnson had taught her to make. The animal's eyes, once filled with terror, gradually softened with trust. Mary recognized that look. It mirrored her own transformation since arriving at the cabin. "You're a natural healer," John remarked one evening, watching her gentle movements as she changed the fox's bandages. His weathered face creased with pride. Those words planted a seed inside Mary Smith. She began venturing deeper into the forest, basket in hand, studying plants with newfound purpose. The mountain man showed her which mushrooms could reduce inflammation and which tree bark could ease pain. Mary absorbed every lesson, her thin fingers growing more confident as they sorted leaves and roots. When the fox finally limped away, healthy enough to return to the wild, Mary felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She had given life back to something broken just as John had done for her. "I want to learn more," she told him, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "About all the plants that heal." John nodded, retrieving a worn leather-bound book from a shelf. "This was my grandmother's," he explained. "She knew more about mountain medicine than anyone." Mary spent hours studying the faded pages, experimenting with tinctures and teas. She created a salve that eased John's arthritic hands, and brewed a tea that calmed her own nightmares. Each small success built her confidence, transforming her from a victim into someone who could offer help. But while Mary blossomed on the mountain, darkness brewed in Hollow Creek. The villagers, frustrated by their failed attempts to retrieve her, twisted their failure into something sinister. Whispers spread from house to house, growing more malevolent with each telling. "The mountain man has bewitched that Smith girl," they murmured in the village square, using dark arts to keep her captive. Others claimed John was teaching Mary forbidden practices, turning her against her own kind. The same people who had once shunned her now painted themselves as concerned saviors. The trapper passing through brought news of these rumors to the cabin. "They're saying unnatural things about you both," he warned John. "Best keep your guard up." That night, Mary stood at the cabin window, watching shadows dance across the valley below. The village lights seemed menacing now, like predatory eyes watching their mountain sanctuary. "Are you afraid?" John asked, joining her. Mary considered the question. "Not of them," she answered finally. "I'm afraid of losing what we've built here." The mountain man placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll just have to be stronger than their hate." Mary Smith sat by the cabin window, her thin fingers tracing patterns in the condensation as she watched the forest beyond. The rumors from Hollow Creek had reached them even here, carried by the wind and occasional travelers who braved the mountain paths. She was caught between two instincts that pulled at her with equal force to retreat further into the safety of their mountain sanctuary, or to stand and face the whispers that had once driven her away. "I could hide forever," she whispered, more to herself than to John, who was stoking the fire. "But then I'd always be running." John Johnson looked up, his weather-beaten face illuminated by the dancing flames. "There's wisdom in both hiding and confronting," he said, setting the poker aside. "The strongest animals know when to stand their ground and when to seek shelter." The mountain man moved to sit beside her, his large frame somehow gentle in the small space they shared. "Strength isn't measured by how often you fight, but by knowing which battles matter." Mary nodded, understanding flowing between them without need for many words. Over the months, their communication had evolved into something deeper than speech, a shared language of survival and trust. "They think they know me," she said, her voice stronger now, "but they only know the starving girl who wasn't worth helping." "And who are you now?" John asked, his question hanging in the air like the smoke from their hearth. Mary straightened her shoulders. "I'm someone who can read the clouds before a storm comes, someone who knows which berries heal and which harm. I'm someone who belongs here." Together, They began preparing for whatever might come. Mary gathered herbs from their small garden, drying some for medicine and preserving others for the lean months ahead. She had learned to interpret the subtle changes in bird calls that signaled approaching strangers, and practiced moving silently through the underbrush as John had taught her. The cabin itself became their fortress. They reinforced the door with additional timber, gathered extra firewood, and stored rainwater in barrels along the eastern wall. Mary found herself applying lessons from nature, like the way foxes prepare multiple escape routes from their dens to their own sanctuary. "We're not just surviving anymore," she told John one evening as they finished sealing cracks between the logs with moss and clay. "We're living on our terms." John nodded, pride evident in his eyes. The frightened child he'd found in the forest had grown into someone resourceful and determined. He knew that whatever came from the village below, whether reconciliation or conflict, Mary would face it not as a victim, but as someone who had found her own power on this mountain. "Tomorrow," she said with newfound resolve, "we'll practice reading the land signs again. I want to be ready for anything." The crackle of twigs outside the cabin made Mary Smith freeze. John Johnson was teaching her to identify healing herbs when they both heard the deliberate footsteps approaching. The mountain man's weathered face hardened as he motioned for her to stay behind him. "I know you're in there, John," called a voice that carried equal parts authority and hesitation. "We need to talk." John exhaled slowly, recognition softening his features. "Robert," he murmured, more to himself than to Mary. "Stay close," he instructed as he moved toward the door. Robert Brown stood in the clearing, his city clothes marking him as an outsider in this wilderness. His eyes widened at the sight of the young girl partially hidden behind John's imposing frame. "So it's true," Robert said, removing his hat. "The whole village is talking about how you've taken in Mary Smith. Some are saying you've kidnapped her." John's jaw tightened. "Is that why you've tracked me down after all these years? To accuse me of something so vile?" Robert shifted uncomfortably. "We were friends once. I needed to see for myself." Mary stepped forward, surprising both men. "You saved me," she said firmly. "The village left me to starve after my parents disappeared." Inside the cabin, Rufe's gaze traveled over the modest but comfortable space, the neatly organized herbs hanging from rafters, the two separate sleeping areas, the books stacked carefully on handmade shelves. "You've changed," Robert observed, accepting the cup of pine needle tea John offered. "The man I knew wouldn't have opened his door to anyone." "Maybe I needed to change," John replied simply. As daylight faded, the three sat around the fire while Robert explained his journey to find them. He had heard the whispers in Hollow Creek, stories that painted John as a dangerous recluse who had spirited away a vulnerable child. Mary listened intently, understanding for the first time how the outside world perceived their arrangement. She saw the complex history between these two men, friendship fractured by time and circumstance. "She's learning to heal," John explained, his voice gentle but firm. "She has a gift for it." Robert studied Mary's face, noting the healthy color in her cheeks and the quiet confidence in her eyes. "And you're happy here?" he asked her directly. "I'm safe here," Mary answered, "and I'm becoming strong." Something in her steady gaze convinced Robert. By morning his suspicions had melted away like frost in sunlight. As he prepared to leave, he clasped John's hand. "I'll set the record straight in the village," he promised. Mary watched him disappear down the mountain trail, understanding that sometimes loyalty meant trusting someone enough to question them, and wisdom meant recognizing truth when you saw it. The autumn winds announced themselves with a ferocity that even Inan Johnson hadn't witnessed in his many years on the mountain. Dark clouds rolled in like an invading army, bringing with them a deluge that seemed determined to wash away everything they had built. For 3 relentless days, rain hammered against the cabin walls, finding every weakness in their shelter. "I've never seen it this bad," John muttered, placing another bucket beneath a persistent leak in the corner. Water dripped rhythmically, joining the chorus of other makeshift containers scattered throughout their home. Mary Smith watched as rivulets formed along the ceiling beams. The cabin that had become her sanctuary now seemed fragile against nature's onslaught. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, bending mighty trunks and sending smaller branches crashing to the sodden ground. By the second day, their food stores had dwindled alarmingly. The mountain man's face grew more concerned as he assessed their situation. "We might need to tighten our belts for a while," he said, dividing what little remained of their dried meat. But rather than succumbing to fear, Mary straightened her shoulders. "I can help," she said firmly. Despite the downpour, she wrapped herself in the woolen blanket that had once symbolized her rescue and now served as her armor. Between cloudbursts, she ventured out, returning with handfuls of mushrooms growing in the protected hollows of trees. She recalled every lesson John had taught her about identifying safe fungi, moving with a confidence that surprised them both. "Where did you learn to patch a roof like that?" John asked as he watched her nimble fingers work with strips of bark and pine resin to seal the worst of the leaks. "I watched you," she replied simply, her hands never stopping their methodical work. When the stream threatened to overflow its banks, Mary devised a system of trenches to divert water away from their cabin. She collected rainwater in clean vessels, ensuring they wouldn't lack for drinking water when the storm muddied their usual source. The transformation was undeniable. The girl who had once cowered against village walls now stood tall against the elements. John found himself following her lead, amazed at how she'd absorbed every lesson he'd offered and now applied them with intuitive skill. On the fourth morning, when the clouds finally parted and sunlight streamed through the trees, they surveyed their home. Despite the storm's best efforts, they had prevailed. The cabin stood, their supplies had been preserved, and most importantly, they had discovered a new balance in their relationship. "You're not just surviving anymore," John said quietly, pride evident in his voice. "You're thriving." Mary smiled, understanding the weight of his words. She was no longer merely the protected, she had become a protector in her own right. The first frost of winter painted the mountain with delicate silver patterns. Mary Smith stood at the cabin's threshold, watching her breath form clouds in the crisp morning air. Inside, John tended the fire, its warmth a stark contrast to the memories of her abandoned family house in Hollow Creek. "Someone's coming," Mary announced, her keen eyes spotting movement on the trail below. The mountain man joined her, his weathered face revealing no surprise when he recognized the visitor as Samuel Green, the baker's son who had once been kind to Mary when others turned away. Samuel approached cautiously, stamping snow from his boots before delivering news that made Mary's heart skip. "The village is changing," he explained, offering a small package of bread as a peace offering. "The elders have been meeting. They speak of you both, the girl who survived and the man who showed more humanity than all of Hollow Creek combined." According to Samuel, stories of Mary and John had spread through whispered conversations at the village well and around evening fires. Their tale of resilience challenged the superstitions that had ruled Hollow Creek for generations. Some elders, burdened by guilt, had begun questioning the cruelty that drove a 14-year-old girl into the wilderness. "They say it was war. What happened to you?" Samuel admitted, unable to meet her eyes. "Some are asking if the real curse was how we treated our own." After the young man departed, Mary sat by the hearth, fingers tracing patterns in the wooden table John had crafted during their first summer together. "Do you think they really care or just fear what they've become?" John considered her question carefully, stirring a pot of rabbit stew. "People change when they see their reflection clearly," he finally replied. "Your strength showed them their weakness." That night, as wind whistled through pine branches, Mary realized something profound. The mountain, once merely a refuge from cruelty, had transformed into something more sacred. Here, she and John had created a bond stronger than blood, forged through shared hardship, mutual respect, and quiet moments of understanding that needed no words. Their cabin stood as a testament to possibility. Inside these walls, Mary had learned to read weather patterns, set broken bones, and find beauty in solitude. John had rediscovered purpose, after years of isolation, his patient guidance healing old wounds. Neither had spoken aloud. "We've become symbols to them," Mary whispered as they shared tea before sleep. The mountain man nodded, his eyes reflecting firelight. "But we're real to each other," he answered simply. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the mountain in pristine white, nature's way of marking endings and beginnings. The place once meant for exile had become the foundation of something new, something hopeful, something entirely their own. The morning frost had barely melted when three figures appeared on the winding path leading to the cabin. Mary Smith tensed as she recognized Elder Wilson among them, his stooped figure unmistakable even at a distance. John placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as they watched from the porch. "They've come to talk," he said quietly, "not to threaten." The delegation from Hollow Creek approached with cautious steps, their expressions a mixture of shame and desperation. Elder Wilson removed his hat, revealing thinning white hair that caught the sunlight. Beside him stood Mrs. Chambers, the schoolteacher, and Thomas Reed, whose daughter had recovered from fever thanks to Mary's herbal remedies, sent down the mountain last month. "We've come to ask for your help," Elder Wilson began, his voice cracking with age and humility. "The village is changing. People speak of your knowledge, your healing ways." Mrs. Chambers stepped forward. "The same superstitions that drove you away are now being questioned." "We were wrong, child." Mary studied their faces, searching for deceit, but finding only weariness and regret. The village that had once shunned her as cursed now sought her guidance. The irony wasn't lost on her. "We need someone to teach us," Thomas added. "Someone who understands both the old ways and new possibilities. Someone who can help us become better." John remained silent, allowing Mary to speak for herself. She had grown not just in height, but in confidence during her time on the mountain. No longer the frightened girl who had stumbled into the forest starving and alone, she stood tall beside her protector. "I won't return to live in the village," Mary said, her voice steady and clear. "This mountain is my home now." The elders exchanged glances, disappointment evident in their posture. "But," she continued, "I will help from here. Those who wish to learn can come to me. I'll share what I know about healing and survival." She gestured toward the cabin, toward John, toward the life they had built together. "I've learned that home isn't where you're merely tolerated. It's where you're valued for who you are." Elder Wilson nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his roomy eyes. "On your terms, then." "On my terms," Mary affirmed. As the delegation departed down the mountain path, John turned to her with pride warming his weather-beaten face. The girl who had once been invisible was now setting boundaries, making choices that honored her worth. "You've come far," he said simply. Mary smiled, watching the emissaries grow smaller in the distance. She had found not just survival on this mountain, but the freedom to define her own place in the world. The last patches of snow glistened in the morning sun as Mary Smith stood at the threshold of the cabin, watching the narrow mountain path with a mixture of apprehension and resolve. Spring had returned to the mountains, bringing with it not just new growth, but new visitors. "They're coming again today," Mary said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Her voice, once timid and broken, now carried the quiet confidence of someone who had survived the impossible. John Johnson nodded, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "You've become quite the attraction," he replied, setting down the herbs he'd been sorting. "The healer of the mountain." The transformation had been gradual, yet profound. What began as desperate villagers seeking help for ailments they couldn't cure, had evolved into regular pilgrimages up the winding path to their cabin. Mary, once the outcast of Hollow Creek, had become its reluctant savior. A family appeared around the bend, a mother carrying a feverish child, the father supporting an elderly woman who struggled with each step. Mary recognized them immediately, the Wilsons who had once crossed the street to avoid her gaze. "Welcome," she called, stepping forward to help them up the final stretch of path. "Bring him inside where it's warm." Inside the cabin, Mary worked with practiced efficiency, brewing the pine needle tea she'd perfected over the winter. Her hands, once skeletal and trembling, moved with purpose as she mixed in the honey John had traded for last autumn. "The fever will break by nightfall," she explained, demonstrating how to apply the cool compress. "But he needs rest and plenty of water." The elderly woman watched Mary with wonder. "To think we drove you away," she whispered, "when all along you had this gift." Mary caught John's eye across the room. The mountain man stood quietly by the window, his pride evident in the way he observed her work. In saving her, he had found redemption for his own past failures, the woman he couldn't protect, the life he had retreated from. As the afternoon progressed, more villagers arrived seeking advice on spring planting, treating minor injuries, or simply sharing news from below. The cabin, once a fortress against the world, had become a gathering place where knowledge flowed freely. "You've built something remarkable here," John told her later, as they watched the last visitors descend the mountain path. "Something neither of us could have created alone." Mary nodded, feeling the weight of her journey in every breath. From the starving girl shunned by all, to this moment of purpose, the path had been brutal, but standing here now, she wouldn't trade it for anything. "We both found what we needed," she replied simply, "a home worth fighting for." The nightmares still came occasionally, but they no longer held the same power over Mary Smith. Sitting by the cabin window, watching dawn break over the jagged peaks, she traced her fingers over the worn edges of her mother's journal. The pages that once brought tears now offered comfort, a bridge between what was lost and what had been found. "Some days are still harder than others," she confessed to John one evening as they shared a simple meal of rabbit stew. The mountain man nodded, his weather-beaten face softening in the firelight. "Healing isn't a straight path," he replied, his voice gentle. "It winds like the mountain trails." Mary had spent months wrestling with the belief that she somehow deserved abandonment, that worthiness was something to be earned rather than her birthright. Each time villagers climbed the mountain seeking her healing knowledge, a small voice inside questioned if she was truly deserving of their respect. But John never wavered. His steady presence reminded her daily that value wasn't measured by others' treatment. When she doubted herself, he would point to the fox they had saved, now occasional visitor to their clearing, as proof of her inherent gifts. "Your mother knew," John said one evening, gesturing toward the journal Mary kept close. "That's why she wrote those words for you to find." The 14-year-old nodded, remembering the passage that had become her mantra. "Hope is not foolishness, it's the courage to believe in possibility when darkness seems complete." As spring blossoms dotted the mountainside, Mary began teaching younger children from the village. Their wide-eyed wonder as she explained which plants could heal and which could harm mirrored her own early lessons with John. In their faces she recognized her past self, and in their growth, her own transformation. The cabin, once merely shelter from cruelty, had become a sanctuary where pain was acknowledged, but not given the final word. Visitors often remarked how the modest dwelling seemed to radiate peace, as though the very walls had absorbed the healing that happened within them. "We've made something rare here," John observed one evening as they watched the sunset paint the distant peaks. "Not just survival," Mary nodded. "Understanding complete." Their story had traveled beyond Hollow Creek, carried by travelers and traders, a tale of resilience that offered others a template for their own healing. What began as desperate flight had become a journey toward wholeness. The mountain that once loomed as her last resort now stood as testament to possibility. Mary had learned that belonging wasn't about a place, but about finding those who saw your true self and choosing to be seen. Mary Smith stood at the forest's edge, the wind tousling her hair as she gazed down at Hollow Creek. The village lights twinkled in the distance, no longer symbols of rejection and pain, but simply another place, one that held no power over her anymore. The true test hadn't come from the villagers or their suspicions. It had emerged from within her own heart. "Are you certain?" John asked, his weathered hand resting gently on her shoulder. The mountain man's eyes reflected the same quiet strength he'd shown since that first night he found her starving in the woods. Mary nodded, feeling the weight of her decision settle comfortably around her. "This mountain taught me who I am," she said. "Down there I was defined by what I lacked. Up here I discovered what I could become." Together they turned away from the view of Hollow Creek and walked the familiar path back to their cabin. The structure had grown over the seasons, a new room for healing herbs, a covered porch where villagers could wait for consultations, even a small garden where Mary cultivated plants that once seemed impossibly delicate for mountain life. As winter melted into spring and spring blossomed into summer, word of the mountain healer spread beyond Hollow Creek. People journeyed from neighboring settlements, bringing stories, ailments, and gifts in exchange for Mary's remedies and John's wisdom. The cabin, once a refuge from cruelty, transformed into a beacon of hope. Robert visited occasionally, bringing news and supplies. His initial suspicion had evolved into genuine respect, and he often sat with John by the fire, mending their fractured friendship while Mary prepared meals from foraged ingredients. On quiet evenings, Mary would sometimes read from her mother's journal, finding new meaning in words that once brought only tears. Find someone trustworthy, her mother had written. In John, she'd found not just trust but partnership. Two wounded souls creating something beautiful from their shared pain. The young girl who once pressed herself against abandoned walls, invisible and starving, now stood tall as a woman of purpose. Her hands, once trembling with hunger, moved with confidence as she mixed healing tonics and taught others the mountain's secrets. "We've built something rare here," John remarked one evening as they watched the sunset paint the peaks in gold and crimson. Mary smiled, understanding the depth behind his simple words. They had created more than a home or a healing place. They had forged a legacy of resilience that would outlast them both. In the wild heart of nature, surrounded by the whispers of pine trees and the distant calls of birds, Mary had discovered the truth. Home wasn't a place you were given, but something you built with courage, compassion, and the determination to transform suffering into strength.